A dog from a K-9 unit discovers a secret room in a nursing home and what they found buried for more than a decade. The discovery shook the foundations of the institution, unearthing secrets no one ever imagined could exist within those seemingly innocent walls. The late afternoon sun filtered lazily through the windows of the Meadowbrook Senior Living Facility, casting long shadows on the polished floor. Nurse Carolyn Garcia adjusted her crisp white uniform as the scent of vegetable soup filled the halls, mingling with the unmistakable smell of disinfectant. She'd only been working there for a few months, but already something felt off. The strange, furtive glances from staff, the whispers that died out the moment she entered a room, and, most of all, the suffocating silence that seemed to cloak every corner. "Morning, Mr. Henderson." Carolyn greeted one of the residents dozing in a chair by a window. The old man barely responded with a slow, deliberate blink. Like so many others, he seemed to have resigned himself to a monotonous routine, the days drifting by without joy or pain between scheduled medications and bland meals. That Tuesday afternoon, Carolyn was making her usual rounds when she noticed that Max, the therapy dog, wasn't following her as he normally did. The German Shepherd stood several feet behind her, completely still in front of a locked door at the end of the east hallway. Carolyn watched the animal with curiosity. Max was a retired K-9 police dog who now provided companionship to residents. His once coal-black snout was now flecked with gray, a sign of his age, but his amber eyes held an incredible intelligence and sharpness. "What's wrong, boy?" Carolyn asked, retracing her steps. The dog's gaze remained fixed on the door, ears pricked, body tense. Suddenly, Max let out a deep, guttural growl that sent a chill down Carolyn's spine. It wasn't his usual playful bark, or even the warning growl he sometimes gave to strangers. This was something primitive, almost a wail. Carolyn slowly approached the door. There was no special sign, just a single number, 316. She tried to turn the knob, but it was locked tight. "There's nothing here, Max." "Let's go," she said, trying to sound reassuring, but a shiver ran down her spine. The dog refused to budge. His paw seemed glued to the floor, his intense gaze shifting between Carolyn and the mysterious door. Finally, after several attempts, the nurse managed to coax the animal away, but she couldn't help but notice how Max repeatedly turned his head back as if the door held some strange magnetic pull. That night, as she recorded patient vitals in her notebook, Carolyn couldn't shake the image of the dog in front of door 316. What had Max's heightened senses detected? What secret was buried in that forgotten corner of Meadowbrook Senior Living? Max wasn't just any dog. With his gold and black coat beginning to show signs of age, the German Shepherd had served with distinction in the K-9 unit for 8 years. His senses, honed by years of training and experience, were sharper than ever, able to detect what humans overlooked. Carolyn had read his backstory when he'd first arrived at Meadowbrook, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. As they walked down the east hallway, the nurse watched the dog stop abruptly in front of door 316. His posture changed, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Carolyn, used to ignoring her own instincts after years of working in hospitals where efficiency mattered more than intuition, couldn't help but feel a tremor run through her. "What's up, kid?" she whispered, crouching beside the dog. Max kept his gaze fixed on the door, as if he could see right through it. The young nurse examined the entrance. It looked just like the others, with its metal number and a standard lock. But unlike the other rooms, she'd never seen anyone go in or out of this one. In the days that followed, Max's behavior became more insistent. Whenever their rounds took them near that part of the hallway, the German Shepherd would tug on his leash, pulling Carolyn toward the mysterious door. The ritual was always the same. 3 short barks, a tense pause, then a long, mournful howl that echoed down the hallway, drawing uncomfortable glances from the staff. "Carolyn, could you control that animal?" Director Henderson reprimanded her one morning, irritably adjusting his tie. "We have patients who need peace and quiet." "I'm sorry, Director," she replied, stroking Max's back to calm him. "He seems to be bothered by something in this area." "He's just an old dog," the director responded dryly, walking away with brisk steps. But Carolyn knew that wasn't the case. She'd worked with therapy animals before, and none had ever shown this level of agitation without a reason. That night, she reviewed the blueprints of the facility, looking for any anomaly in the room layout. Room 316 was simply labeled as a storage closet. But why keep a simple storage closet locked up? One afternoon, while the residents were enjoying a music session in the common room, Carolyn stopped in front of the door. Max sat beside her, expectant. The nurse placed her hand on the cold surface and thought she heard something. A sigh, a murmur. It was impossible to be sure, but a sense of unease grew inside her like a seed watered by doubt. Carolyn began noticing small but disturbing anomalies at Meadowbrook that she couldn't ignore. While checking medical records during her night shift, she discovered alarming discrepancies. Patient names that didn't match official records, medications that vanished from inventory without explanation, and, most chillingly, access codes used at 3 a.m. when no one was supposed to be in certain areas. "Everything's in order, Carolyn. These are normal clerical errors," Director Henderson assured her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes when she presented him with her findings. The nurse nodded, but the seed of doubt had already taken root. Every night, she meticulously reviewed the records, jotting down each inconsistency in a notebook she hid in her locker. The coincidences were too many to be simple mistakes. Meanwhile, Max grew more and more restless. The German Shepherd, who usually maintained a serene demeanor during his therapy sessions with the elderly, now stopped obsessively in front of door 316, scratching at the wood and letting out short, persistent barks. "What is it, buddy? What's in there?" Carolyn whispered, stroking his graying fur as she nervously glanced around to make sure no one was watching them. One particularly busy afternoon, Carolyn was helping serve snacks in the common room. The residents chatted quietly while sipping tea and eating cookies. Max was by Mrs. Albright's side, an elderly woman with Alzheimer's, who was always calm by his presence. Suddenly, the dog's ears perked up, and he fixed his gaze on Josh, a maintenance worker who was walking by them distracted. With a swift move that surprised everyone, Max lunged at the man. Carolyn held her breath, fearing the dog would bite him. But Max simply grabbed something dangling from the employee's belt and retreated, his prize clenched between his teeth. "Max, drop it!" Carolyn exclaimed, hurrying over as Josh checked his belt in confusion. The dog came to her and dropped the object into her hand, an old metal key, rusted with age. Carolyn turned it over in her fingers, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw the faded yellow tag hanging from it. Though the paper was worn, the number 316 was still clearly visible. Their eyes met, Max's, intense and determined, as if to say, "Now you have no excuse. We have to open that door." Carolyn hesitated for a moment, holding the key. A shiver ran down her spine, but something inside her, perhaps that instinct she had ignored so many times in her career, screamed that she had to go through with it. Max, sitting beside her, watched her with those deep eyes that seemed to perfectly understand the internal struggle she was having. The nurse glanced both ways down the hall, making sure no one from the Meadowbrook team could catch her. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant murmur of the television in the common room. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock of door 316. The metallic click echoed like thunder in her chest, making her hold her breath. The door opened with a slight creak. Carolyn expected to find a simple supply closet or old files, but what she saw left her paralyzed. A perfectly tidy room stretched out before her eyes. 2 impeccably made beds with clean white sheets, shiny medical equipment that looked as if it had just been installed, and dark monitors that reflected the faint light coming from a small window with half-open blinds. And there, in the middle of that space that seemed frozen in time, an elderly man in a wheelchair stared at the wall. His face, etched with deep wrinkles, was as motionless as a living statue. Carolyn took a hesitant step inside, and Max followed, pressing against her leg as if to protect her. "Hello," she whispered in a barely audible voice. "I'm Carolyn Garcia, a nurse here." The old man didn't respond immediately. His wrinkled hands rested in his lap, and for a moment Carolyn thought he hadn't heard her, but then he slowly turned his head. His sad eyes seemed to hold decades of silent stories. "I knew someone would come eventually," he said in a voice raspy from disuse. "The dog knew it too." Carolyn took another step, her heart pounding. The room smelled of antiseptic and something else she couldn't quite place. On the walls were framed photographs of landscapes she didn't recognize, and on a small table sat an untouched glass of water. "Who are you?" she asked, approaching cautiously. "You're not listed in any of the records I've reviewed." The man gave a bitter smile that didn't reach his eyes. "My name is Gerald Lopez," he replied, now looking directly at Max. "And I'm here because I know too much." Gerald Lopez didn't seem surprised when Carolyn entered the room. His eyes, sunken beneath thick gray eyebrows, remained fixed on the wall as if he'd been waiting for this visit for years. The old man's face, furrowed with deep wrinkles that told silent stories, held a quiet calm that contrasted with the nurse's racing pulse. Carolyn advanced cautiously on the gleaming floor. Every beat of her heart seemed amplified in the silence of that perfectly neat room. Max, ever attentive, sat beside her like a sentry. The German shepherd kept his ears pricked and his gaze watchful, as if sensing dangers invisible to humans. "I knew someone would come eventually," Gerald mumbled in a raspy voice. "That dog has an instinct, unlike the doctors here." The man turned his wheelchair with a practiced movement and opened the nightstand drawer. His hands trembled, but they were determined. He pulled out a notebook with a worn cover. He held it to his chest for a moment before offering it to Carolyn. "They were buried, not in graves, but in files," he whispered as he handed her the notebook. "No one should just disappear like that." Carolyn took the notebook, feeling the weight of something more than paper. When she opened it, she discovered pages filled with meticulous handwriting, names, dates, codes, and detailed notes. Some paragraphs were underlined in red ink, others crossed out as if someone had tried to erase them from existence. "What is Project Echo?" she asked, pointing to the repeated references on several pages. The old man closed his eyes for a moment. Max approached and rested his head on Gerald's knee, and Gerald instinctively stroked the animal's graying fur. "It started as a study on memory and trauma," he explained in a firmer voice. "It ended up being something none of us could control." Carolyn carefully turned the pages. Each sheet revealed names of people, experimental drugs, and coded procedures. In some small, discolored photographs, she could make out frightened faces, including one that looked familiar. "Júlia," Carolyn murmured, recognizing the woman from room 317. Gerald nodded slowly. "Subject 13. The youngest in the program," the man confirmed, his fingers tapping nervously on the chair's armrest. "I documented everything. It was my way of resisting." Max let out a soft whine, as if he understood the gravity of the discovery. Carolyn felt she had just crossed a threshold from which she could not return. The nights became an ordeal for Carolyn. Every time she closed her eyes, the words from that worn notebook danced in her mind like restless ghosts. The names meticulously noted on those yellowed pages didn't match any official records at Meadowbrook. She scoured the database, digital files, and even the oldest paper charts, but it was as if these people had never existed. Gerald himself seemed to be a ghost. The nurse reviewed medical records and resident lists, and even discreetly contacted former employees. No one remembered the man with the furrowed face and sad eyes in room 316. "If you could talk to me, Max, what would you tell me?" Carolyn whispered, stroking the German shepherd's fur during her nightly rounds. The animal tilted his head as if he truly understood the gravity of the situation. His presence became the young woman's only comfort in those hallways that now felt oppressive and filled with secrets. One afternoon, taking advantage of Director Henderson's absence for a meeting, Carolyn ventured into the general archives in the basement. The dust accumulated over the years made her sneeze as she sorted through forgotten folders on rusty metal shelves. Among the administrative documents, she found a cryptic reference to Project Echo 2010 transfers. Project Echo, she muttered to herself, remembering the mention in Gerald's notebook. When she tried to access more information, she hit a wall of institutional silence. The administrative assistant denied her access to certain files, citing medical confidentiality. The head of maintenance abruptly changed the subject when she asked about renovations in the West Wing. Even the normally chatty cook fell into an awkward silence when Carolyn mentioned room 316. The complicity was palpable. They all seemed to be part of a conspiracy of silence, protecting something that shouldn't come to light. They're hiding something terrible, she confessed to Max as they took a break in the garden, and I think Gerald is the key to figuring it out. The dog rested his head in the nurse's lap, as if offering his unconditional support. Carolyn caressed his graying muzzle, grateful to have at least one ally in a place that felt more and more like a prison of secrets. That night, she made a decision. If the official channels were blocked, she had to seek outside help. She needed someone with access to information she couldn't get, someone who could move in circles where she had no entry. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in a long time. The fluorescent light in the nurse's station flickered as Carolyn reviewed medical records on her night shift. The silence of Meadowbrook was broken only by the occasional creak of old pipes. She'd been comparing documents for hours when her finger stopped at an anomaly. Several high-potency medications were assigned to patients who didn't appear in any official records. Invisible patients, she muttered to herself, a shiver running down her spine. Code names, Subject 7, Subject 11, Subject 13, appeared regularly on night medication charts. Carolyn wrote down the dates in her small notebook and noticed a disturbing pattern. They all coincided with nighttime movements recorded in the West Wing, right where the mysterious door 316 was. The nurse closed the file and put it back in its place, making sure no one saw her. Director Henderson could fire her on the spot if he discovered her research, but she couldn't turn back now. Gerald's notebook mentioned subjects with similar numbers. The next morning, Max waited for her impatiently at her room door. The German Shepherd seemed more alert than ever, as if he knew they were on the verge of discovering something important. Carolyn stroked his graying head and whispered, "What else do you know, buddy?" During her morning rounds, the young woman tried to act normally, but her mind was racing. As she handed out medication to the legitimate residents, she couldn't stop thinking about the other patients hidden behind closed doors. Max, who usually followed a predictable routine, suddenly changed direction during their walk. The animal pulled on his leash, leading Carolyn down a little used hallway. He stopped in front of another door, marked with the number 317, as forgotten and discreet as its neighbor. The dog began to scratch at the wood with his claws, leaving small marks on the worn surface. Then he looked at Carolyn with eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom in the world. "Is there someone else in there?" she asked quietly, even though she knew she wouldn't get a verbal response. Max replied with a soft but urgent groan. Carolyn looked both ways down the deserted hallway and made a decision. If she'd found the key to room 316, there had to be another one for this door, maybe on the same keychain she'd seen hanging from that employee's belt. Curiosity overcame fear. Carolyn patted Max's back and promised him in a low voice, "We'll come back tonight. We're going to find out what's behind that door. I promise." The animal seemed to understand, sitting obediently as she memorized every detail of the door that, like the one before it, held secrets someone had tried to bury for years. Door 317 opened with a creak that sent a shiver down Carolyn's spine. Max stayed by her side, attentive and with his ears pricked. What they found inside wasn't a storage closet, but an aseptic room lit by a fluorescent light that flickered intermittently. In the center, sitting in a metal chair, was a young woman. Her blank gaze was lost on a spot on the white wall. She wore a faded blue hospital gown, and her dull hair hung unkempt over her shoulders. A loose plastic band on her wrist bore a code, Subject 13. "Hello," Carolyn whispered, approaching cautiously. The woman didn't react. Max, contrary to his usual behavior with strangers, approached delicately and rested his graying muzzle on the stranger's knee. This contact seemed to spark something in her. Her once vacant eyes slowly focused on the animal. "What's your name?" the nurse asked, kneeling to be at her height. The silence stretched for several seconds. The woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out, as if she had forgotten how to speak. Carolyn returned the next day and the next, and each visit was the same. She would sneak in, Max would approach the woman, and the two would sit in silence for what seemed like an eternity. The nurse spoke to her in a soft voice, telling her stories about the residents, describing the weather outside, a world that seemed alien to this prisoner. One afternoon, as Carolyn brushed her hair with slow, rhythmic movements, she felt a tear roll down the woman's cheek. "You're safe," she murmured, gently wiping the tear away. "I won't let them hurt you anymore." 3 weeks passed. Trust was built slowly, like a fragile bridge between two shores. Carolyn started bringing her small objects, a flower from the garden, a magazine with colorful pictures, a new brush. The woman received them with trembling hands, as if they were priceless treasures. It was on a rainy afternoon when it happened. Carolyn was reading a poem aloud while Max dozed at the foot of the bed. Suddenly, a broken, barely audible voice interrupted the reading. "Julia," the woman whispered, touching her own chest. "My name is Julia." Carolyn held her breath, afraid that any sudden movement would break the fragile moment. Max raised his head, as if he too had understood the importance of those words. "Julia," Carolyn repeated with a smile. "That's a beautiful name." That night, as she closed the door to room 317, the nurse made a silent promise. She would help Julia reclaim not only her name, but her full identity and her freedom. And she would find out, at all costs, why this young woman had been locked away and forgotten in the shadows of Meadowbrook. Carolyn knew she needed allies outside the nursing home. With Gerald's notebook hidden in her bag, she left the facility that afternoon, her heart pounding. She had arranged to meet with Paul Martinez, an old college friend who now worked as a health compliance consultant for several medical institutions. They met at a discreet diner, away from prying eyes. Paul greeted her with a warm hug, but his expression changed when he saw the worry on Carolyn's face. "You sound paranoid, you know that?" he said after hearing her story, absent-mindedly stirring his coffee. Places like Meadowbrook are under constant supervision. Carolyn took out the notebook and placed it on the table. "I want you to see this first," she muttered. The worn pages contained meticulous notes, coded names, dates, dosages, and reactions. Gerald's trembling handwriting documented years of observations. "This could be anything," Paul insisted, though his voice no longer sounded so confident. "It could be the imagination of a confused old man. What about the drugs that don't show up in any records, and the rooms that don't exist on the blueprints?" Carolyn pulled out the photos she'd taken on her phone. "Julia's not in any database. Neither is Gerald. It's like they don't exist." Paul's skepticism crumbled as he reviewed the documentation. His experience told him that these inconsistencies were too systematic to be mere errors. "We have to follow the money," he finally concluded. "If this, Project Echo, exists, someone is funding it." In the weeks that followed, they dedicated every free moment to the investigation. Paul used his contacts to access financial records, while Carolyn collected more evidence inside the facility, always with Max as her silent guardian. They discovered that the funds came from a network of shell corporations that continued to operate under different names. The project seemed to have ramifications at other similar facilities across the country. "This is much bigger than we thought," Paul whispered one night, showing Carolyn documents that linked Meadowbrook to 4 other residences. "And there are powerful names involved." Carolyn felt a chill. Every discovery brought them closer to the truth, but it also increased the risk. She noticed suspicious glances from the staff, and Director Henderson called her into his office twice to question her about her excessive interest in certain patients. "We have to be more careful," Paul warned. "I think they're starting to suspect." Paul nodded gravely as he put the documents back in his briefcase. "We're on dangerous ground, Carolyn, but we can't go back now." Director Henderson's office felt smaller than usual that afternoon. Carolyn sat in the chair across from his desk as the director watched her with a mix of irritation and calculation. The dim light filtering through the window cast long shadows across the room. "Carolyn, I understand your concern for the residents, but what you're suggesting is absurd," the director began, clasping his hands on the table. "Secret rooms, unregistered patients. This sounds like a thriller, not the reality of our facility." The nurse met his gaze without blinking. She'd been expecting this conversation ever since she started asking questions about door 316. "I saw the documents with my own eyes," she replied firmly, but without an ounce of defensiveness. "And Max isn't wrong. That dog has an instinct many people would envy." Henderson leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of professional concern. "You're putting too much faith in a retired animal," he said. "Perhaps you should take a few days off. Stress can make us see things that aren't there." "Did I invent Júlia and Geraldo too?" Carolyn asked, leaning forward. "Or the medication records that don't match any official patients?" The director stood up slowly, circling the desk to perch on the edge too close to her. The scent of his expensive cologne filled the space between them. "Listen to me very carefully," he whispered, his tone menacing. "You have a promising future in nursing. Don't ruin it with conspiracy theories. Your reputation, your career, even your ability to find employment at any healthcare facility in this region, it's all at stake." Carolyn felt a tremor in her spine, but the memory of Julia's lost eyes and Gerald's sad gaze weighed more than her personal fear. "You're threatening me." "I'm protecting you from yourself," he replied, returning to his chair. "There are things bigger than you or I at stake here, things you wouldn't understand." As she left the office, Carolyn's legs felt weak. She leaned against the hallway wall, taking a deep breath. The fear was real, almost tangible, a physical presence that followed her with every step, but she also felt something stronger growing inside her, determination. She thought of Max, of how the old German shepherd had risked his comfort to lead her to that door. If a dog could be so brave, how could she back down? "I can't abandon them," she muttered to herself as she walked to the room where she knew Max would be waiting for her. Her duty went beyond administering meds and taking vitals. It was to protect those the system had decided to forget, to bury alive behind locked doors and falsified files. It had been a long night. Max stood guard outside room 316 without moving for a moment, as if facing an invisible danger. Carolyn watched him from the nurse's station, admiring the dog's loyalty as she finished her reports. When her shift finally ended, the German shepherd was still there, motionless. "Come on, boy, time to rest," Carolyn whispered as she approached him. But when she touched his fur, she felt him trembling. The dog's eyes, normally alert, seemed dull, and his breathing was shallow. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way. "Max?" Carolyn knelt beside him, checking his body for any injury. She found nothing visible, but the dog was burning with fever. With an effort, the nurse lifted the animal into her arms and carried him to the small room where he usually rested during his nightly vigils. For 3 days, Carolyn barely left Max's side. She gave him antibiotics she'd borrowed from the facility's pharmacy, placed cool compresses on him, and gave him water with a syringe when the dog couldn't drink on his own. In whispers, she told him stories and promised that together they would solve the mystery. "You can't give up now," she'd tell him, stroking his graying muzzle. "Júlia and Gerald need you. I need you." In those moments of vigil, doubt began to creep in. She was putting not only her career, but Max's life at risk. Maybe Director Henderson was right, and she should forget everything. To go back to being just a nurse who followed orders without asking uncomfortable questions. One afternoon while Max was sleeping, Carolyn entered room 317. Julia was sitting by the window, her gaze lost on the horizon. When she saw Carolyn enter, a faint smile lit up her face. "How is he?" she asked in a weak voice. "He's fighting," Carolyn replied, "just like all of us." Julia extended her trembling hand and took the nurse's. "Before you came, no one saw us. We were ghosts." Julia didn't have to finish the sentence. Carolyn nodded, feeling the lump in her throat dissolve. Then she visited Gerald, who handed her some additional pages he'd been keeping hidden under his mattress. That night, when she returned to her room, she found Max trying to stand. Weak but determined, the dog looked at her with an intensity that seemed to see past lies and secrets. "We're in this together, aren't we?" Carolyn murmured as she hugged the animal. Max's soft growl was all the answer she needed. The nurse knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but there was no turning back. As she stroked the dog's fur, her resolve grew stronger. She wouldn't rest until all the prisoners of Meadowbrook were free. Paul spent 3 full nights poring over the worn notebook Carolyn had found. Under the dim light of his desk lamp, the health compliance expert discovered something that would change the course of the investigation. Gerald was not simply another victim of the system, but a privileged witness who had meticulously documented every step of Project Echo. "Carolyn, you have to see this," Paul told her when they met at a diner far from Meadowbrook. Gerald was an insider. The way he writes, it sounds like he was part of the medical team at first, but something made him switch sides. The nurse reviewed the pages where Gerald detailed experimental procedures, patient names, and the exact dates of each intervention. His handwriting, shaky but precise, revealed the anguish of a man torn between his professional duty and his conscience. "Pages are missing," Carolyn pointed out, running her fingers along the jagged edges where someone had ripped out several sheets. "Someone didn't want us to see all the content." Paul nodded gravely. "Probably the ones that could directly identify the highest level decision makers." Meanwhile, at the facility, Carolyn took advantage of a moment of distraction from the staff to access older digital files. There she found something that chilled her to the bone. In the classified reports for Project Echo, a codename Max appeared repeatedly. "It can't be a coincidence," she muttered to herself, remembering the German shepherd who had started this whole discovery. The gray-muzzled dog was not simply a retired therapy animal. According to the documents, he had been trained specifically to detect neurological changes in patients undergoing experimental treatment. That night, as she stroked Max's fur in her apartment, Carolyn felt a new wave of determination. Carolyn understood the magnitude of what they had discovered. The animal looked at her with his deep eyes, as if he perfectly understood his role in the story. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she whispered. "That's why you were so insistent about those doors." The dog rested his head in Carolyn's lap in a gesture that seemed to confirm her suspicions. He wasn't just their guide in the investigation, but a key piece of the puzzle they were putting together. The next day, when Carolyn shared her discovery with Paul, the man turned pale. "This is much bigger than we thought," he said. "If Max was part of the project, it means someone deliberately took him out of the program and put him in the nursing home. Someone who wanted the truth to get out." The pressure on Meadowbrook grew by the day. Rumors spread through the city like wildfire. Carolyn watched nervously as local journalists began to hang around the main entrance, hungry for information about the irregularities some of the staff had leaked. After weeks of media pressure, health officials called a hearing to investigate the allegations. Carolyn received the official summons and felt her stomach churn. It was one thing to uncover the truth in the privacy of those quiet hallways, and quite another to publicly expose herself to those responsible for Project Echo. "I can't do this," she murmured, stroking Max's graying fur as he rested at her feet, his gaze watchful. "I'm gonna lose my job, my reputation, everything." That afternoon, Carolyn visited Julia in her new protected room. The young woman, who had begun to regain a certain sparkle in her eyes, listened in silence. "If you don't speak, who will speak for us?" Julia asked, in a voice that seemed firmer than ever. "I can't do it alone, but I'll be with you." That unexpected courage from someone who had suffered so much deeply moved the nurse. That night, Carolyn reviewed all the documents Paul had helped her organize. On the day of the hearing, she arrived under a gray dawn. The state capitol building was packed with employees, journalists, concerned relatives, and curious onlookers. Director Henderson occupied a prominent seat, surrounded by lawyers. His gaze met Carolyn's, a silent warning. With trembling hands, Carolyn placed the worn notebook on the table. She took a deep breath and began her testimony. "What you will find in these documents is evidence of non-consensual acts committed against vulnerable people," she declared, her voice gaining strength. Project Echo is not a wellness initiative, but a secret experimentation program. She presented meticulously altered medication records, file inconsistencies, and the pages from Gerald's notebook. When Julia entered the room, supported by a social worker, a murmur went through the audience. "I am Subject 13, Julia said in a broken but determined voice. "For years I had no name or past. I was just a number in their experiments." The silence that followed was absolute. The words of both women hung in the air, heavy as lead. Carolyn felt that Max, though physically absent, was with her in spirit, giving her the strength she needed to face what came next. The courtroom was completely silent when the back door opened. Carolyn held her breath, recognizing the figure who advanced with a firm step, Dr. Stephen Quintana. The gray-haired man in the impeccable suit did not look like someone on the run, but like someone who knew he was protected. "I apologize for the interruption," he announced in a serene voice as he sat down. "But I feel it's necessary to clear up some misunderstandings about Project Echo." Carolyn exchanged glances with Paul. Her friend's hands clenched into fists under the table as murmurs swept the room. Max, sitting next to the nurse, let out a low, almost inaudible growl. The doctor unfolded a folder of official documents for the commission. They were government contracts with seals that protected him from any direct accusation. The experimental research, he explained with calculated coolness, had high-level authorization for advances in experimental neurological treatments. These patients participated voluntarily, Quintana said, avoiding looking directly at Carolyn. All procedures followed approved protocols. Carolyn stood up, trembling with indignation. "Voluntarily? Julia barely remembers her full name. Gerald was kept a prisoner for years with no outside contact." The commission president tried to calm things down, but the tension was palpable. Journalists who had been on a simple beat were now taking notes frantically. The story of Meadowbrook could no longer be contained within four walls. "Side effects. Regrettable, but accounted for in the consent forms," the doctor replied, adjusting his glasses with a mechanical gesture. Paul leaned into the microphone. "Could you show us those signed consents, doctor?" The silence that followed was more telling than any answer. As she left the hearing, Carolyn found several journalists waiting for her. The cameras captured her exhausted face as Max remained faithfully by her side. By dusk, the major news channels opened with the story of the scandal at the nursing home. In the days that followed, media pressure grew exponentially. Although Quintana avoided immediate legal responsibility thanks to his contacts, public opinion became relentless. Other health centers in Chicago, Miami, and Los Angeles began to be investigated. "I didn't expect it to go this far," Carolyn confessed to Paul as they watched the television in her apartment, as similar complaints multiplied. "The truth always finds a way," he replied, stroking Max's back as he dozed between them. "Even if some try to bury it under official contracts and seals." Julia began to awaken from her long mental lethargy. Sitting by the window of the small apartment where Carolyn had housed her for protection, her eyes came to life as fragments of her past emerged like pieces of an incomplete puzzle. "There were 7 of us in the blue room," she muttered one afternoon, startling Carolyn, who was making tea in the kitchen. They called us by numbers, but I heard their names when the guards thought we were sleeping. The nurse sat across from her, taking meticulous notes. Every memory of Julia's was pure gold for the investigation. She described other locations with chilling precision. One in Chicago with boarded-up windows, another near Miami, where patients were transferred in vehicles with tinted windows at night. They told us we were volunteers, but I never signed anything, the young woman explained, rubbing her wrists as if she could still feel the restraints. They changed our medications every week and wrote down how we reacted. Max, ever attentive, rested his head in Julia's lap as the tears began to fall. The dog, with his protective instinct, seemed to perfectly understand the pain those memories caused. Meanwhile, Paul unearthed a financial network that spread like a spider's web across the country. In his office, crammed with documents, the health compliance expert created a map with red strings connecting shell companies. "Carolyn, this is much worse than we thought," he told her on the phone one night. "Meadowbrook is just one of 17 facilities involved. The funds come from a foundation that's supposedly researching Alzheimer's treatments, but the money ends up in offshore accounts." Paul discovered that Project Echo had been in operation for more than a decade, using vulnerable people as test subjects for experimental drugs. The record showed that some of the drugs were later marketed by large pharmaceutical companies, with no mention of the unethical trials. Julia's testimony was crucial as authorities began investigating other facilities. Her precise descriptions of the procedures and personnel matched exactly what was found in Chicago, confirming that this wasn't an isolated case, but a systematic operation. Gerald, from his now legal room at Meadowbrook, also contributed, identifying photographs of doctors and nurses who had worked at the different centers. His trembling hands pointed to faces in the pictures as he whispered, "He gave the shots. She wrote down the effects." The magnitude of Project Echo shocked everyone. What had begun as a retired dog's curiosity in front of a forbidden door had uncovered one of the country's biggest healthcare scandals. Carolyn's life changed drastically after the hearing. Returning to the facility, the atmosphere was cold. Her colleagues, who used to share coffee and laughs during breaks, now looked away when she entered the common room. Some whispered accusations that she had betrayed the facility. Others simply feared being implicated in the scandal. Director Henderson summoned her to his office just 48 hours after her testimony. In a controlled but resentful voice, he told her he was considering her termination for misconduct and breach of confidentiality. Carolyn kept her composure, though she trembled inside at the thought of losing her job. "You put this whole institution at risk," the director said, tapping his desk gently with a pen. "Decades of reputation ruined by your unfounded suspicions." The residents watched her with a contradictory mix of emotions. Some of the elderly avoided her as if she were carrying a contagious disease. Others gave her looks of silent admiration when no one else was looking. A 92-year-old woman squeezed her hand during morning medication and whispered, "I always knew something wasn't right in the West Wing." The nurse got through each shift like someone crossing a minefield. The social isolation was painful, but what truly sustained her was the news that Paul shared about Julia and Gerald. Both were transferred to a specialized center where they received proper psychological and medical care. "Julia is remembering more every day," her friend said during a clandestine phone call. "Yesterday she mentioned her family in Chicago. We're trying to locate them." Gerald, for his part, had begun to write a detailed diary about his years of captivity. His therapist assured them that this process, though painful, was essential for his recovery. During her now lonely and tense night rounds, Carolyn would stop in front of rooms 316 and 317. The doors remained open, the rooms empty and sanitized, as if they had never held any secrets. The administration ordered them converted into storage rooms, erasing all physical evidence. Despite the personal cost, every time Carolyn remembered Julia's eyes regaining their sparkle or imagined Gerald writing freely, she felt a deep certainty. She had chosen the right path. The fear and rejection were a small price compared to the freedom of those who had been buried alive, hidden behind doors no one dared to open. After weeks of intensive care, Max finally regained his strength. Carolyn spent entire nights with the German Shepherd, giving him medicine and whispering words of encouragement. The vet had diagnosed him with extreme exhaustion, but she suspected it was something deeper, as if the weight of the secrets had also affected the animal. One spring morning, Max woke up with renewed energy. His eyes shone as brightly as when he first pointed to that mysterious door. Carolyn took him to the Meadowbrook garden, where the sun bathed the rose bushes and created patterns of light through the trees. There, watching the dog run among the residents who greeted him with affection, the nurse understood that they had both been changed forever. "He looks like a new dog," commented an old woman, stroking the animal's back. Carolyn nodded thoughtfully. It wasn't just Max who had changed. She felt different herself, as if she had crossed an invisible threshold toward a braver version of herself. The connection between them had transformed into something almost mystical, forged in adversity and sealed with a truth few had dared to acknowledge. In the afternoon, Carolyn took Júlia to the garden for some fresh air. The young woman, once afraid of open spaces, now stretched out her arms in the sun, as if to embrace her newfound freedom. Her recovery progressed slowly. Some memories returned like fragments of a broken mirror, while others remained buried in the shadows. "Sometimes I dream of a house by the ocean," Júlia confessed one afternoon. "I don't know if it was real or if it's just a wish." Carolyn squeezed her hand gently. She knew Júlia's past might never be fully reconstructed, but that no longer mattered. The future was open to them like a blank canvas. Authorities recommended that Júlia change her identity for her safety. Those responsible for Project Echo, though exposed, still had powerful connections. To protect her, Carolyn had offered her own apartment as a temporary sanctuary, creating a safe space where Max stood guard every night. "We're a strange family, aren't we?" Júlia said one night over dinner. Carolyn smiled, seeing Max resting at Júlia's feet with protective devotion. It wasn't the family she had ever imagined, but it was real and precious. Three souls united by extraordinary circumstances, learning together to heal invisible wounds. At Meadowbrook, Max had become a silent symbol of resistance. The residents looked at him with new respect, as if they sensed his role in the revelation of those dark secrets. And Carolyn, with every walk through those gardens, felt that they had rescued something more valuable than the truth, the dignity of those who had been forgotten. Paul couldn't just go back to his normal life after what had happened. Every night, he obsessively reviewed the documents salvaged from Meadowbrook, searching for connections between the different facilities involved in Project Echo. His apartment had become a labyrinth of papers, photos, and maps that pointed to possible similar facilities across the country. "There have to be more people like Júlia and Geraldo," he confessed to Carolyn during one of their weekly visits. "I can't abandon them." His colleague, Marta Sanchez, a journalist specializing in health issues, had been instrumental in the investigation. She had contacts in hospitals and nursing homes throughout the region. She was the one who received the latest documents, contracts signed with code names, and multi-million-dollar transfers to offshore accounts. "This is bigger than we ever imagined," Marta said on the phone the night before she disappeared. "There are congressmen involved, Paul. Be careful." The next morning, Marta didn't answer his calls. Her apartment was intact, but her computer was gone. The police filed the case as a, quote, voluntary disappearance. Despite Paul and Carolyn's protests, nothing at Meadowbrook was the same again. The hallways, once silent by routine, were now silent out of fear. Staff spoke in whispers and avoided rooms 316 and 317, as if the walls could hear and punish the indiscreet. Carolyn noticed the sidelong glances when she entered the common room. Some considered her a hero, others a traitor who would tarnish the facility's reputation. The management had changed. Director Henderson was quietly transferred. But the new administrator seemed more interested in burying the scandal than in reforming the system. "Do you think Marta's okay?" Carolyn asked, stroking Max's back as he rested at her feet during a break. "I want to believe so," Paul replied, deep circles under his eyes betraying his sleepless nights. "Maybe she had to go into hiding. She had backups that I don't." The dog raised his head as if he understood the gravity of the conversation. His instinct had been the trigger for everything, and now he seemed to share his humans' concern. The residents had changed too. Those who still had their wits about them looked at the new doctors with suspicion. Fear had settled into every corner, turning what was supposed to be a home into a place where the shadows seemed longer and more threatening. "Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing," Carolyn whispered. "The truth always comes at a price," Paul replied, holding a photo of Marta between his fingers. "But silence costs more." Carolyn sat on a park bench, watching intently as the last rays of sun filtered through the branches. 3 months had passed since the hearing, and the emotional scars were still fresh. The nurse had learned a painful lesson. As much as she wanted to, she couldn't save everyone who had been a victim of Project Echo. Some files remained sealed, others disappeared, and many people were left without a name or a history. "Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing," she whispered, stroking Max's back as he rested at her feet with a watchful gaze fixed on the horizon. The German Shepherd responded with a soft groan, as if he understood her doubts perfectly. Carolyn had lost friends among the staff, but she had gained something more valuable: the certainty that her calling went beyond giving meds or taking vitals. Now she fought for the dignity of those who couldn't defend themselves. Júlia approached with uncertain steps, but firmer than she had been weeks earlier. She was no longer just Subject 13. She had reclaimed fragments of her identity, though many memories remained buried in the shadows. "Gerald asks if you can visit him today," the young woman said, sitting next to Carolyn. "He has new names he wants to share with you." The nurse nodded. Each name rescued was a victory against oblivion. Paul warned them that the system would try to silence them again, but this time they were ready. The health compliance expert had created a support network with journalists and human rights advocates who were continuing the investigation. "You know," Carolyn murmured, watching Max sniff something in the distance, "when I started working here, I just wanted to do my job well. Now I understand that protecting those closest to me is my real mission." Dr. Quintana remained free, protected by government contracts and powerful lawyers. Director Henderson had been quietly transferred to another facility. The system had tried to erase the tracks, but the truth had seeped through its fingers like water. Max suddenly stood up, his ears alert. At 10 years old, many would consider him a retired dog, but his instincts were still as sharp as they were when he served in the K-9 unit. Carolyn watched him with admiration. The animal everyone believed to be retired had shown he still had one last mission to complete. "Let's go," Carolyn said, standing. "Gerald's waiting for us." As they walked down the hallways, the nurse understood that the past could not be erased, not with silence and not with threats. The fight would continue, day by day, rescuing stories and restoring the dignity of those who had been reduced to numbers in an inhumane experiment. A growl, a bark, a secret unearthed. That's how it all started, with Max standing in front of a door no one wanted to open. Now, months after the public hearings, Carolyn watched the sunset from the garden of the new facility where she worked. The Meadowbrook case had shaken the foundations of the healthcare system. 17 similar facilities were investigated, and more than 30 people were prosecuted for their involvement in Project Echo. Dr. Stephen Quintana, despite his government connections, now faced a trial that promised to be historic. Carolyn caressed Max's back, his fur showing more gray with each passing day. The German Shepherd rested peacefully, as if he knew his mission had been fulfilled. It was he who, with his unerring instinct, had detected what humans had chosen to ignore. "You always knew what was going on in there, didn't you?" the nurse whispered. Júlia approached with cautious steps. Her recovery was progressing slowly, but with each passing day, she remembered a little more of her former life. She had found out she had a sister in Chicago and planned to visit soon. "I dreamed of that room again," the young woman confessed, sitting next to Carolyn. "But this time, I wasn't scared. This time I could open the door and walk out." Gerald had passed away 2 months earlier. His body, weakened by years of non-consensual experiments, didn't survive the winter, but he died peacefully, knowing that his worn notebook had been the key to dismantling the network. Paul continued his search for Marta. His colleague was still missing, but new clues suggested she might be in hiding in Portugal. The health compliance expert was convinced she had information about the project's international branches. Director Henderson had been sentenced to 8 years in prison. The former director maintained his innocence, claiming he was only following orders from above. Nobody believed him. "Sometimes I think about all the ones we couldn't save," Carolyn murmured, watching the sun paint the horizon orange. "But you saved so many," Julia replied, holding her hand. "You saved me." Max suddenly sat up, sniffing the air. For a moment, Carolyn felt like she was back on that first day in front of door 316, but the animal simply detected the arrival of Paul's car, bringing new information about the investigation. The truth continued to emerge, painful but necessary. The price had been high, careers destroyed, lives lost, persistent threats. But as she watched Max greet Paul with joy, Carolyn knew she would do it all again. Because some secrets should not stay buried. Because some barks deserve to be heard.